Welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And welcome, Sip and Talkers.
You know, every single morning I wake up and the first thing I do is I check the economic news. And I have to say, looking at international headlines and then the stock market just, going up and down like a roller coaster.
It makes your mood pretty complicated.
It really does.
Exactly. It's like 1 minute it's too sweet, the next it's bitter enough to make you frown. But, we're actually going to talk a little bit about finance today, and then we're going to jump into two major, really complex topics.
Okay.
First is the peace agreement President Trump is pushing for Ukraine, and the second is China's really aggressive propaganda campaign, claiming a resurgence of Japanese militarism.
Right. And these things might seem so far removed from our morning coffee, but, they're subtly influencing everything. The economic markets, geopolitics, and maybe even our next travel destination, our investment decisions, or lifestyle choices.
Perfect. So grab your coffee. We'll start with let's call it the sugar of the economy, and then slowly sip into the bitterness of agreements and propaganda. Let's figure out what's brewing in global dynamics together here on Sip and Talk.
Did you just come up with that line?
I may have.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into the U.S.-China-Taiwan clash.
Mm-hmm.
And we're specifically focusing on this Sino-Japanese militarism row, but all framed by a look at global finance and that shifting dynamic in Ukraine.
Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the economic engine, the thing everyone's talking about, artificial intelligence. We are just drowning in discussions about large language models, generative AI, the potential for AGI. The competition feels frantic.
It's absolutely frantic. Billions and billions of dollars are being invested. But what's really fascinating, and I think something the markets kind of overlook, is how all this chaotic competition, it actually funnels profits into one very, very narrow lane.
Okay, explain that. Because you'd think with so many players, the money would be spread out.
You would think so. But what's happening is that despite, say, Google's immense resources and its technical lead in some models, the core technology, these large foundational models from Meta, OpenAI, XAI, they're quickly becoming, believe it or not, commodities.
Commodities, like oil or corn.
In a way, yeah. The barrier to entry to build a functional large model is just dropping so fast. Everyone is moving at breakneck speed just to catch up with each other.
So if everyone is running the same race, who profits? It's not the runners, it's the company selling the running shoes and the water bottles, right?
That analogy is spot on. It's perfect. NVIDIA is the primary, I would almost say the singular beneficiary of this intense AI arms race. Every single entity, whether it's a tech giant challenging Google or a startup building a niche model or even a smaller nation trying to stand up its own AI capability, they all have to buy NVIDIA GPUs.
They're the toll booth.
They are the critical infrastructure toll booth for the entire industry.
And when you dig a little deeper, it's not just brand loyalty. There's a reason they dominate, isn't there? It comes down to fundamental economics and just better hardware. I'm thinking of the NVIDIA GB200 versus, say, the Google TPU V6.
Absolutely. The detailed analysis is really compelling. When you look at the hardware efficiency, we're talking about superior performance in what's called the total output token count.
And that's just how many words the chip can process at once.
Basically, yeah. How many words or data points it can process per unit of time. It's critical for training and running these massive models. The GB200 just has a significant advantage there. But, beyond the raw performance, it really boils down to cost effectiveness.
Okay, so break down cost effectiveness for us, because it's not just the sticker price of the chip, is it?
No, not at all. In a data center, cost effectiveness is this whole bundle of things. It's power consumption, it's the physical space it takes up, how it integrates with your networking gear, and this is critical, the software support.
Software.
Right. Data center operators value reliability and easy deployment above almost everything else. And NVIDIA's CDA software ecosystem is just so mature, so well supported, that the GB200 is consistently the superior option for building out this scalable, high-density AI infrastructure. It just works.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, connecting that performance directly to physics, to heat. If these chips are so powerful, they must generate an incredible amount of heat, which limits how many you can cram into a server rack.
You've hit on the next revolution. The future, as NVIDIA is designing it, is liquid, not air. The most forward-thinking design they're pushing right now is the GB200 NVL72 rack.
NVL72.
Yep. It's a high-density, fully liquid-cooled cabinet. And it has to be. The power consumption of these new Blackwell superchips, the GB200s, it's astronomical, which means the heat output is just as high.
So the move to liquid cooling isn't some luxury add-on. It's a physical necessity.
It's a necessity. Precisely. If you try to stuff that many high-power cards into a traditional air-cooled rack, you hit thermal limits almost immediately. The system becomes unstable, your energy efficiency goes out the window, the physics of it just demands liquid cooling to keep performance up and your electric bill manageable.
And this leads to NVIDIA's just brilliant strategic move. They're not just selling the chip, they're selling the entire architecture for the industry. They're pushing this NVL72 rack design to something called the Open Compute Project, the OCP.
And this is a masterstroke. The OCP is an organization that basically sets standards for data center design. So by contributing their own high-density NVL72 design to the OCP, NVIDIA is essentially setting the reference design, the blueprint, for the entire industry's next generation of AI hardware.
So even their rivals, the ones trying to build their own custom AI chips, they'll probably have to make them fit the physical standards and cooling requirements of the NVL72 design.
Exactly, because that's what the huge data center operators are going to build. It speeds up mass production for everyone in the supply chain, and it locks in their architecture as the foundation everyone has to build on top of.
Wow.
And the demand signals are already there. We're seeing major customers, OpenAI, Oracle, the massive cloud providers, placing orders for hundreds of thousands of GB200 chips. And for that kind of scale, the NVL72 liquid-cooled cabinet is quickly becoming the default, if not mandatory, way to do it.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. From the micro level of chips to the macro level of the economy, the huge question hanging over the Federal Reserve, over all policymakers, is can this AI boom actually deliver a real structural boost to productivity?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? And the Fed is watching very, very closely. The big hope is that AI can significantly boost productivity without also triggering, huge inflationary wage spirals. The dream is to replicate that non-inflationary boom we saw in the 1990s with the tech revolution.
But the data is tricky. I mean, economists have always struggled to measure productivity, especially for knowledge work. And now you throw generative AI into the mix, and it must make it even harder to measure.
It absolutely does. Economists are being very cautious. They're admitting it could take several years for real substantive data to show up in the national accounts. I mean, how do you quantify the efficiency gain when a financial analyst can now use an AI to sift through a decade of SEC filings in minutes instead of weeks? It doesn't show up neatly in the GDP numbers right away.
But we are seeing those little micro examples that give you hope.
They are. And they're compelling. For instance, there are reports about heavy industry companies using specialized AI software to help their technicians repair old, complex equipment. And the savings are huge. In some cases, up to 8 hours per person per week, just in diagnostic time.
8 hours a week.
8 hours a week. If you scale that kind of efficiency gain across millions of workers, across entire sectors, it absolutely moves the needle on national productivity.
So that's the sugar then. The potential for technology to solve some of our big structural growth problems.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's pivot to where the financial markets are showing some brittleness, the hidden risk lurking in the private credit market.
This is a really critical area, and it doesn't get enough attention. Private credit is massive. It's a global market now worth over $1.5 trillion.
$1.5 trillion.
So it's systemically important, and fundamentally, it's just lending money directly to companies that often can't get enough capital from, say, a traditional bank or the public bond markets.
And why can't they go to a bank? Are they just riskier bets?
Often, yes. They might have higher debt levels already, or maybe they're smaller, or they're in a fast-growing but volatile sector that banks find too risky. The lending often comes in these specialized forms like unitranche loans, which are sort of a hybrid debt that's flexible but usually involves higher leverage.
Okay, so let's talk about the risk. Who's holding it? First, the company borrowing the money. What are they facing right now?
The risk for the borrower is immense, especially right now in this high-interest, slowing economy. They have these heavy interest burdens that are just mounting. If their revenue stalls or they can't refinance their debt, they face a really high risk of default or even bankruptcy.
And if the borrower defaults, that risk immediately just jumps over to the funds that lent them the money, the private credit fund.
Exactly right. And the lenders, they're sophisticated investors. We're talking about pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth funds. They're all looking for higher yields than they can get in public markets. So when borrowers go bankrupt, those loans turn into substantial bad debt for the friends.
Which leads to?
It leads to asset value depreciation and direct losses for those very same institutional investors. Your pension could be at risk.
So the danger here isn't necessarily another 2008-style, sudden collapse, but maybe a deep, painful market contraction, a long squeeze.
That's the consensus. The private credit market doesn't have the same kind of liquidity risk as, say, the stock market. But a rise in bad debt forces a really painful period of what's called deleveraging funds, having to aggressively reduce their debt exposure, which causes a market contraction. Capital gets pulled back very quickly.
And that rising risk in these sort of opaque markets is exactly the kind of anxiety that gets way worse when there's geopolitical instability, right?
Yes.
When the world feels volatile, investors panic and they pull back from anything that looks high risk.
It's the perfect storm, and that is the perfect transition to our geopolitical friction points.
But before we do that...
Yes. Before we jump into those heavier topics, a necessary note.
No.
We have to state very clearly that any mentions of market data, stocks, bonds, or Bitcoin in this discussion are for reference only. They're derived from the sources we've analyzed, and we are not investment experts.
This is for informational purposes only. You have to do your own independent homework and research.
Please do.
All right, let's start with the relationship between the U.S. and China, framed by that really high-stakes phone call between President Trump and President Xi Jinping.
Right, so the call happened. And President Trump's team immediately came out and characterized it as a huge success. They described it as transactional, smooth.
The typical positive diplomatic spin.
Exactly. His summary focused on 4 core areas: trade, cooperation on fentanyl, soybeans, and Ukraine. He really emphasized that they had accepted invitations to visit each other's countries, framing the whole thing as this, thawing of relations.
Sounds like a message aimed squarely at a domestic American audience. Farmers, people concerned about the opioid crisis.
Precisely. The goal was clearly to demonstrate diplomatic mastery and a focus on getting wins for the domestic economy. But then you look at the official Chinese readout of the same call, and it offered a dramatically contrasting narrative. It was like they were describing 2 completely different conversations.
So what was China's focus?
The official Chinese summary specifically and emphatically highlighted the Taiwan issue. While the U.S. readout barely mentioned it, China used the platform of the highest level call they could have to publicly reassert its red line on Taiwan.
Wow. That is narrative control at its peak, isn't it?
It is. China uses that high-level platform to signal to 2 audiences. First, to their domestic audience, to reaffirm national resolve. And second, to the international audience, to warn against any interference, especially with the rhetoric from Japan getting stronger.
So this clash in narratives really reveals a deep strategic divide. If future U.S. diplomacy toward China stays highly transactional, as critics suggest it might, there's a serious concern that support for Taiwan,
which Beijing calls its core interest of core interests,
could be leveraged or even sacrificed to get a deal on something else, like trade.
That's the fear. That puts Taiwan in an extremely precarious position where their security becomes a bargaining chip in a much larger transactional negotiation. It shifts the dynamic from a strategic commitment to a tactical negotiation, and that's inherently unsettling for any ally.
Okay, let's shift over to Ukraine, because we have to talk about this highly controversial U.S.-led peace initiative. The process behind this whole proposal seems deeply problematic from the get-go.
It's extremely flawed, and critics have been very vocal about it. The U.S. proposal, which started as 28 points and got revised, was developed in consultation with Russia.
Right.
But, and this is the crucial part, without prior comprehensive consultation with Kyiv.
Wait, hold on. You're trying to broker peace for the victim of an aggression, and you don't fully involve them in drafting the terms. What kind of message does that send?
Critics view it as a serious violation of Ukrainian national sovereignty. They're equating it to an imposed peace. The argument is that when a major power dictates the fate and borders of an invaded country without its full consent, it violates the principles of international law.
It sends a terrible signal globally that military aggression can eventually be rewarded with favorable terms brokered by outside powers. But let me play devil's advocate for a second. If the U.S. doesn't step in with some kind of proposal, even an imperfect one, doesn't the war just drag on forever? More death, more destruction. Isn't an imperfect peace better than a never-ending war?
That is the counterargument. And supporters of the initiative argue that an imperfect pause, a ceasefire, saves lives right now and maybe resets the board for future talks. But the critics counter that the specific terms in the plan showed a clear leniency toward the aggressor.
What were the specific examples of that leniency?
Well, sources indicate the initial proposals included things like a potential permanent ceasefire line that heavily favored Russia's current territorial gains, and suggestions of rolling back sanctions that were seen as way too premature. This emphasis on improving relations with Russia, critics argue, it risks validating the invasion.
And it signals to the world that if you're an aggressor and you just hold on long enough, you might get a favorable deal.
You might just get away with it.
Let's look at Ukraine's response then, because they've made their own red lines crystal clear, and they seem like total deal breakers.
They have 3 foundational non-negotiable points. The first one is territorial integrity. Ukraine absolutely refuses to cede any territory that is not already under Russian control. To give it up voluntarily would be to legitimize the entire invasion.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second?
Their own military posture. They object to any requirement to reduce the scale of their own defense. This is about the security disadvantage. Being forced to demilitarize would just make them a perpetually vulnerable target.
So any peace deal that leaves Ukraine weaker than it was before isn't really peace, it's just a pause for Russia to reload.
That's exactly how they see it. It's an invitation for Russia to try again in a few years.
And the third point, which seems like the most critical one, is about security guarantees.
This is the absolute crux of the deadlock. The core fear is the lack of credible NATO Article 5-style collective security guarantees.
And just to remind everyone, Article 5 means an attack on one is an attack on all. A binding military commitment.
A binding commitment. Right now, Ukraine has several bilateral security deals, but they're non-binding. They're essentially promises of aid or consultation, not an automatic military response. Without that ironclad promise, Ukraine fears any deal is just a temporary arrangement that Russia can violate whenever it wants.
So even though the U.S. plan was revised down to under 20 points to try and make it more palatable, these fundamental disagreements, they're not going away.
They are not. Russia demands demilitarization. Ukraine insists on sovereignty and real security. It means these peace talks, no matter who is pushing them, are very likely to remain deadlocked for the foreseeable future.
Now we have to transition to Asia, where the tensions are maybe even more combustible because they're just steeped in decades of this unresolved historical trauma. We're talking about China's intense propaganda campaign warning of a resurgence of Japanese militarism.
And this is so much more than a typical diplomatic spat. This is a full-scale information warfare campaign that just escalated dramatically around November of 2025. China launched this massive effort to convince the world that Japan was becoming the new source of Asia's strategic danger.
And the spark that lit this fire, it wasn't a military move. It was a statement, a constitutional law statement from Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi.
That one statement was the trigger. On November 7th, she said that the use of force by mainland China against Taiwan could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. Now, that phrase is a very specific legal term.
Right, because under Japan's pacifist constitution, if a situation is declared survival-threatening, it allows their self-defense forces to exercise collective self-defense.
To potentially intervene. It was a conditional legal explanation of their own law.
And Beijing reacted as if Japan had just ordered an invasion.
The response was immediate and coordinated across the entire state apparatus. The Foreign Ministry, top diplomat Wang Yi, the state newspaper People's Daily, the PLA Daily, they all immediately started talking about unexercised militaristic poison in Japan.
The rhetoric was extreme.
Incredibly extreme. Warning Japan of a more thorough defeat than 80 years ago if it keeps going down this path. They are deliberately framing a modern legal discussion through the most traumatic lens possible, the 1930s.
So they're saying that when Japan talks about a national survival crisis today, it's just like in 1931 with the Mukden incident, which they used as a pretext to invade Manchuria.
That's the exact historical parallel they're drawing. They're viewing Takaichi's words not as a defensive legal necessity, but as a dangerous echo of the past, a justification for future Japanese aggression. They are weaponizing history.
So let's pull back. What are China's real strategic motives for putting so much energy into this propaganda push?
There are 3 big intertwined motives. The first and most powerful is historical memory. The trauma of World War II, the estimated 30 million Chinese casualties, atrocities like the Nanjing massacre. It remains the most powerful emotional lever in Chinese national identity.
So any move by Japan, like a politician Visiting the Yasukuni Shrine or increasing the defense budget can be instantly branded as a return to militarism.
Instantly. It's a tool for emotional mobilization. The second motive is geopolitical containment.
Which is all about Taiwan.
It's all about Taiwan. Taiwan is Beijing's most sensitive core interest. So when Japan says Taiwan's security is linked to its own survival, Beijing sees that as a prelude to an active U.S.-Japan strategy to contain China inside the first island chain.
So by painting Japan as the Asian threat, they're trying to preemptively justify their own future actions.
And pressure other countries in the region to stay away from Tokyo. And the third motive is entirely domestic. It's a classic tool for maintaining stability.
Distractions.
It's domestic cohesion. Amid all the internal pressure, the real estate crisis, sky-high youth unemployment, a slowing economy nationalist propaganda is an incredibly effective tool to transfer public focus away from failures at home. You unite the people against a clear, external, historical enemy.
Okay, so now we have to get to the counter-narrative, which is incredibly harsh. Critics in Taiwan, Japan, the West are calling this entire campaign the thief-catching thief phenomenon.
Right. They're arguing that China is using this propaganda to mask its own far more aggressive behavior.
This is the hypocrisy argument. Let's really dissect this alleged double standard.
The core of the critique is that China is the one currently engaged in active military intervention and making explicit threats of force, while Japan is just hypothesizing about self-defense under very strict constitutional limits.
So let's list the receipts. What are the concrete examples of China's own actions that critics point to?
They point to three main areas. First, the ongoing militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea, building military airfields and missile sites in international waters, claiming huge areas of the sea against international law.
Okay, number two.
The repeated aggressive military drills and air incursions near Taiwan. They're constantly sending planes across the median line. They're practicing beach landing scenarios. It's a constant threat.
And the third is historical precedent.
Exactly. China's own intervention in the Korean War back in the 1950s, which they justified by citing their own survival crisis at the border. Critics say China grants itself the absolute right to intervene anywhere it wants, but forbids Japan from even conceptually discussing the legal basis for its own self-defense.
And this gets into the issue of historical self-reflection, where critics say Japan has changed, but China refuses to acknowledge it.
Absolutely. Critics stress that Japan has issued 22 official apologies for its wartime actions and has fundamentally changed its national identity with a pacifist constitution. Yet they say China uses history like an ATM machine, constantly demanding moral and political payment while strategically ignoring its own massive domestic crimes like the Cultural Revolution.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering. And we can't forget the economic history here.
No, it's so often forgotten in the heat of this propaganda. China was a huge beneficiary of Japanese economic aid after they normalized relations. Japan provided what's called Official Development Assistance, or ODA, to China from 1979 all the way to 2020.
And how much are we talking about?
Over 3 trillion Japanese yen. That money was critical in helping finance China's early industrialization and infrastructure.
So China benefits enormously from Japan's post-war generosity, but the dominant state narrative is always one of victimization and resentment.
It's a strategic choice. And furthermore, critics argue that China, with its military budget over 2.3 trillion RMB in 2025, the second largest in the world, plus its massive spending on internal stability and suppression in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. China is the true current militarist power in the region.
So the argument boils down to this. China is projecting its own current state of military expansion onto its neighbor, labeling Japan's defensive measures as aggression.
That is the core accusation, that China is enforcing this strict party nature over human nature ideology at home and projecting it outward, demanding absolute obedience from its neighbors. And that, critics say, is far more indicative of an extreme ideology than Japan's democratically constrained defense forces.
So if we look at this as pure information warfare, what's the goal beyond just making headlines?
It's textbook gray zone warfare. You use the trauma of history to create fear, to test the loyalty of Japan's international partners, and to pre-build a moral high ground for any future conflict over Taiwan. Hakaichi's very conditional, very legal statement was deliberately stripped of all context and amplified as proof of warmongering to sow distrust between Tokyo and Washington. It's a strategy of applying a double standard. Loose rules for me, strict rules for you.
So when we step back, what we see are two nations trapped in a classic security dilemma. Each one views the other as a growing threat, which then justifies its own military buildup.
It's a threat mirror. Japan's move toward military normalization, the bigger defense budget, clarifying its self-defense rights, it's driven in large part by the massive expansion of China's own military, its new aircraft carriers, its advanced missiles.
So the ultimate conclusion on this is really difficult. China's historical fears aren't entirely invented, but its propaganda is deeply manipulative.
Precisely. While there are legitimate concerns about certain right-wing elements in Japan, China's aggressive campaign completely obscures its own active expansionism. The real danger here isn't one nation's budget, it's the information war itself. It just deepens distrust and makes a tragic miscalculation so much more likely.
Which brings us back to the need for dialogue. I mean, as the world's second and third largest economies, if China and Japan are constantly escalating, the global economy suffers, and the risk of an accidental flashpoint, especially over Taiwan, just skyrockets.
Cooperation is essential. The analysis consistently recommends that dialogue mechanisms, especially between diplomats and defense officials, have to be relaunched. Peace can't be built on military buildups or angry rhetoric. It has to be built on mutual trust to stop Taiwan from becoming the flashpoint that drags everyone into a conflict. So, what does this all mean for you, the well-informed listener? We started with the promise of AI and economic productivity, that sugar promising a technological fix. But we ended up firmly rooted in the old conflicts, the erosion of sovereign rights in the Ukraine peace process, and historical fears fueling this intense military and information war in Asia.
Exactly. We have to be disciplined and see past the headlines and the sophisticated layers of state-backed propaganda. Whether it's China's aggressive rhetoric painting Japan as an existential threat, or the confusing status of a U.S. peace plan drafted without the full consent of the main victim, Ukraine.
This really raises an important question for you to think about. When high-level diplomatic calls, like the one between Trump and Xi, result in such dramatically different public readouts, one focusing on domestic economics, the other on strategic red lines, who are the leaders really trying to convince? Are they speaking to a global audience, or are they prioritizing the political needs and biases of their own people at home?
We want to remind everyone that our role here is just to provide objective facts for discussion and analysis based on the information available to us. We strongly encourage you to exercise critical and independent thinking when you're faced with these complex international narratives. We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoint discussed here.
That's all the time we have for this Sip and Talk.
Thank you for joining us for this crucial conversation on global dynamics. Be sure to subscribe to the Sip and Talk podcast and go check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickytolife. He's got fun memes and latest travel vlogs. We'll catch you next time.